The air in the ancient stone circle was cold, damp and heavy, with the scent of moss-covered granite and something else, something indefinable, like the faint echo of songs sung in languages that predated written history. A single, slender beam of moonlight filtered through the precise alignment of standing stones that marked celestial events with astronomical accuracy, illuminated a flat altar stone at the center of the sacred space. Upon its weathered surface, carved in symbols that seemed to shift between Celtic spirals, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and patterns that belonged to no known culture, was an inscription that made the heart beat faster with recognition of something long forgotten, yet deeply familiar. Before this altar, a lone figure knelt, their silhouette stark against the shimmering moonlight, hands outstretched towards spirals carved so deeply into the stone that they seemed to pull consciousness itself into their hypnotic patterns. From the depths of the earth beneath the circle, a low, resonant hum began to emanate. A sound that vibrated not through the air but through the bones themselves, through the blood, through the ancient memory carried in every cell. What if the Celtic peoples were not merely one culture among many, but the inheritors and preservers of a knowledge system so ancient and so profound that it connected Egypt to Atlantis, the Druids to the mystery schools of the East, revealing that what we've been taught as separate civilizations were actually nodes in a global network of sacred wisdom that the Celts kept alive even as empires rose and fell. What timeless secret did this stone circle conceal, and what profound revelation awaited the one who dared to look beyond the neat categories of academic history, to perceive the delicate threads of a connection that, once seen, would change everything? My name is Lyra, and the call to something beyond had been a persistent, almost haunting echo within my soul since the moment I first touched a Celtic spiral carved into an ancient stone in Ireland, and felt a shock of recognition so profound it brought me to tears. It wasn't a voice in the conventional sense, no audible sound, but a deep, undeniable resonance that pulled me towards the hidden currents of history, towards the whispers of connections that mainstream scholarship dismissed as coincidence or impossible, towards the shimmering edges of reality where mythology and archaeology intersected in ways that defied comfortable explanations. My journey began not in a university or museum, but in the quiet desperation of my own mind, in recurring dreams of standing stones that were simultaneously in Ireland and Egypt, of druids who spoke with accents that sounded suspiciously Middle Eastern, of symbols that appeared in Celtic art, but also in the tombs of pharaohs and the temples of distant lands. Always the same patterns, always the same sacred geometry, as if someone had deliberately planted the same seeds of knowledge across vast distances and cultures. These visions were always accompanied by a profound sense of a great forgetting, a visceral understanding that something essential about human history had been fragmented, compartmentalized, divided into neat boxes of Celtic and Egyptian and Greek, when in reality they were all part of a unified tradition that predated them all. It was in an obscure collection of medieval manuscripts in a monastery in Wales, documents that had survived Viking raids and Norman conquests and centuries of deliberate suppression, that I found the text that would shatter my understanding of history. The manuscript, written in Old Welsh with marginalia in Latin and what appeared to be Ogham script, carried a title that seemed almost defiant in its claim: The Book of Connections, How the Druids Preserved the Ancient Wisdom When Atlantis Fell and Egypt Rose. The text began with a statement that contradicted everything I had been taught. The Celts are not what the Romans said they were, barbarians on the edge of civilization. They are the remnant of the oldest civilization, the keepers of the knowledge that built the pyramids and aligned the stones, the inheritors of the tradition that predates all written history. When the great cataclysm came and the old world was destroyed, some fled east and became the Egyptians, some fled west and became the Celts, carrying with them fragments of the same truth, the same symbols, the same understanding of the cosmos. This is why the spirals match, why the stones align to the same stars, why the mysteries taught in the groves and the mysteries taught in the temples speak of the same journey of the soul. The path unveiled by this medieval manuscript and my recurring visions was not one of comfortable academic research, but a harrowing journey into territories where archaeology, mythology, linguistics, and mysticism converged in ways that threatened every orthodox narrative about human civilization. Each connection discovered between Celtic and Egyptian symbols, each linguistic parallel that shouldn't exist according to standard timelines, each astronomical alignment that suggested shared knowledge of the heavens, each meditation in ancient sites that produced visions of the same events witnessed from different cultural perspectives, brought wave after wave of resistance. There was the intellectual doubt that whispered of confirmation bias and pattern seeking, of seeing connections where there were only coincidences, of abandoning the safety of accepted scholarship for dangerous speculation that would destroy any credibility I had. There was the profound cognitive dissonance of reconciling what I was discovering with everything modern education proclaimed about isolated cultural development, about how ancient peoples could never have communicated across such distances, about how similarities were merely parallel evolution, not actual connection. And there was the existential terror of confronting what it meant if the Celts really were the western branch of a civilization that also manifested as the Egyptians, if the Druids and the priests of Amun-Ra were teaching the same mysteries in different languages, if Stonehenge and the Great Pyramid were built by people who shared the same knowledge of sacred geometry and celestial mechanics. External resistances manifested in predictable yet still painful ways. Archaeologists who insisted that any similarities between Celtic and Egyptian cultures were superficial or coincidental, who dismissed the idea of transatlantic or trans-Mediterranean contact in prehistoric times, despite growing evidence of ancient sea voyages. Historians who refused to even consider that the barbarian Celts could have possessed astronomical and mathematical knowledge that rivaled or surpassed the Greeks. Celtic scholars who accused me of mystical nonsense for suggesting that Druidic traditions preserved genuine ancient wisdom rather than being merely primitive nature worship. Yet there were also unexpected allies, voices from the margins who had seen what I was seeing. An elderly archaeologist, retired and therefore free to speak honestly, who confided over whiskey in a pub near Newgrange. I've spent 50 years excavating Celtic sites, and I'll tell you what they won't put in the textbooks. The mathematics in the stone circles are too sophisticated. The astronomical alignments are too precise. The symbols carved on the stones appear in Egypt, in Malta, in places the Celts supposedly never reached. Either there was contact we refused to acknowledge, or they inherited the same knowledge from an earlier source. I've measured the spiral carvings at Newgrange and compared them to the ones in the Temple of Seti in Egypt. They're identical in proportion, in the ratio of their turns. That's not coincidence. That's shared knowledge. I learned through painstaking research that the connections were far more extensive than even my visions had suggested. The Celtic triple spiral and the Egyptian triple crown represented the same tripartite division of consciousness. The Druidic doctrine of reincarnation and the Egyptian journey through the Duat both mapped the same stages of soul evolution. The Welsh words for certain sacred concepts were suspiciously similar to ancient Egyptian terms. The Celtic goddess Brigid and the Egyptian goddess Isis shared attributes so similar they seemed like regional variations of the same archetype. Most striking of all, the megalithic sites across Ireland, Scotland, Brittany and Wales aligned to the same celestial events as the pyramids and temples of Egypt. suggesting they were built by people who shared the same astronomical calendar, the same understanding of the cosmos. The climax arrived not in any library or lecture hall, but in a profound mystical experience that occurred during the autumn equinox at a stone circle in the west of Ireland, whose exact location I had been led to through dreams and synchronicities too numerous to dismiss. The circle was small, unexcavated, unmarked on any tourist map, surrounded by ancient oaks that seemed to have stood guard for millennia. As I entered the circle at the precise moment of the equinox, when day and night were in perfect balance, when the sun set exactly between two particular stones, something shifted in consciousness, and I was no longer merely Lyra, no longer bound by individual perspective or linear time. I experienced myself as vast, witnessing history from a perspective that transcended the limitations of any single culture or era. I saw the cataclysm not as mythology, but as memory, as lived experience. I saw a great civilization, more ancient than Egypt or Sumer, whose cities now lay beneath the waves or buried under millennia of sediment, a civilization that possessed profound understanding of consciousness, energy, astronomy, the subtle forces that structure reality. I saw how, when their world ended, whether through flood or fire or both, the survivors scattered, carrying with them fragments of the knowledge, the sacred symbols, the techniques of consciousness transformation. Some went east and south, eventually settling along the Nile, becoming the mysterious Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, who built the first temples before the dynasties began. Others went west, island hopping across a very different Atlantic, settling in the lands that would become Ireland, Britain, Brittany. And both groups, separated by thousands of miles, preserved the same essential teachings, the same sacred geometry, the same astronomical knowledge, the same understanding of the soul's journey. I saw druids and Egyptian priests who would have recognized each other instantly as initiates of the same mysteries, even if their languages and cultural expressions differed. I witnessed rituals in sacred groves in Ireland that mirrored ceremonies in Egyptian temples, both designed to align human consciousness with cosmic rhythms, both using the same fundamental principles of sacred space and time. I understood with shattering clarity that the Celtic connection was not minor or peripheral, but central to understanding human spiritual history. The Celts were not barbarians, but inheritors of the oldest wisdom, and their preservation of that wisdom in an oral tradition so powerful it survived Roman conquest and Christian conversion was one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. The vision showed me why this truth had been suppressed, because it meant that the civilized empires of Rome, Greece, and eventually Christian Europe were actually the newcomers, the destroyers of an older and in many ways more sophisticated culture that understood realities the civilized world had forgotten. When I finally returned to ordinary consciousness, I was weeping, my body shaking, lying on the earth at the center of the stone circle, the setting sun painting the ancient stones with gold and crimson light. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our content. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. The revelation did not bring peace, but rather a profound solitude, the isolation of seeing a truth that undermined the foundations of accepted history, of knowing something that made me a stranger in my own civilization. The world continued its familiar patterns. Historians and archaeologists continued publishing papers that carefully avoided the connections I had seen, but I could no longer participate in the collective agreement to keep history compartmentalized and safe. I chose a period of deep contemplation and integration, withdrawing from academic circles that had never fully accepted me anyway, spending months traveling between Celtic sites in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany, and then making pilgrimages to Egypt, Malta, and other places where the same symbols, the same alignments, the same understanding appeared. At each site, I performed meditations and rituals drawn from both Celtic and Egyptian sources, and each time, the experience deepened my understanding that these were not separate traditions, but variations on a single theme. I walked through the passage tomb at Newgrange and felt the same energy signature I had felt in the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid. I stood at the stone circle in Callanish and saw in vision the same stellar alignments that the temples of Karnak mapped. I traced spirals carved on Irish stones and Egyptian pillars, and felt my hand following patterns that transcended either culture, that came from a source more ancient than both. The silence I inhabited was not empty, but full of presences, of whispers from those who had guarded this truth through ages of suppression and forgetting. I understood that the Celtic connection had been deliberately obscured, not necessarily through conspiracy, but through the natural tendency of each conquering civilization to diminish what came before, to paint the conquered as primitive so as to justify their conquest. Rome had portrayed the Celts as barbarians to justify their destruction of the Druids and the sacred groves. Christianity had demonized Celtic traditions as pagan superstition to justify the burning of the groves and the prohibition of the ancient wisdom. Modern academia, heirs to these traditions, continued the same project of diminishment, preferring to see the Celts as interesting but ultimately peripheral rather than as preservers of humanity's oldest spiritual technology. My time in contemplative solitude crystallized a decision. I could not prove what I had experienced in ways that would satisfy conventional scholarship, given that so much evidence had been deliberately destroyed by Roman legions and Christian monks. But neither could I remain silent about a truth that reframed human history and reconnected traditions that had been artificially separated. I began to write, not academic papers that would be rejected by journals, but books and essays that presented the connections in ways that allowed readers to see for themselves, that provided enough evidence to make the case credible, while acknowledging that the ultimate proof lay in direct experience, in visiting the sites, in performing the practices, in allowing the ancient symbols to work their magic on consciousness. I documented the astronomical alignments that Celtic and Egyptian monuments shared, the linguistic parallels that suggested either contact or common origin, the mythological themes that appeared in both traditions, the symbols that were too similar to be coincidental. I created comparative charts showing how the Druidic understanding of the soul's journey through reincarnation and the Egyptian mapping of the afterlife in the Duat described the same process in different metaphors. I traced how certain sacred ratios, like the golden mean, appeared consistently in both Celtic spirals and Egyptian sacred architecture. I argued that the proper question was not whether there was a connection, but what kind of connection? Direct contact, common inheritance from an earlier source, or perhaps both. I understood that my role was not to convince skeptics, but to provide a framework for those whose intuition or experience had already told them that something was missing from the official story, who sensed that the Celts were more than what history books claimed, who felt in their bones when standing in stone circles that these were not the crude monuments of primitives, but sophisticated sacred technologies built by people who understood realities we've forgotten. I spoke at alternative conferences and wrote for publications willing to explore controversial ideas. I created guided meditations that allowed people to experientially connect with the knowledge stream that both Celtic and Egyptian traditions drew from. I taught workshops where participants learned to recognize the same symbols and the same sacred geometry in diverse ancient cultures, helping them see the connections for themselves. And slowly, a community formed of those who were remembering, whose research or visions or direct experiences in sacred sites had led them to the same conclusions I had reached. My final act of service was to compile everything I had learned into a comprehensive work I titled The Celtic Connection: How the Keepers of the West Preserved the Ancient Wisdom. It was part history, part archaeology, part mystical testimony, part call to remembrance. I dedicated it to the Druids who had died, rather than reveal their secrets to Roman interrogators, to the Celtic monks who had hidden fragments of the old wisdom in Christian manuscripts, to all who had preserved across millennia the thread of connection to humanity's oldest spiritual tradition. I understood that the ultimate truth of the Celtic connection could not be proven by external evidence alone, given how much had been destroyed, but would be recognized through resonance, through the part of us that still remembers, even if we don't consciously know what we're remembering. I knew that as more people made the connections, as more researchers followed the threads I and others had illuminated, as more practitioners worked with both Celtic and Egyptian spiritual technologies and experienced their fundamental compatibility, the truth would gradually become undeniable. And on a night when the stars seemed particularly bright, standing once again in the stone circle in Ireland where my vision had occurred, I spoke aloud to the darkness and to whatever presences still guarded these ancient sites. Guardians of the old ways, keepers of the connection, I have done what I could to remember, to reconnect, to reveal what was hidden. The Celtic peoples were never the barbarians history painted them as, but rather the western branch of humanity's oldest and most profound spiritual tradition. The Druids were not primitive priests, but inheritors of a knowledge that built pyramids and aligned stones to the stars. The groves were not superstitious clearings, but outdoor temples as sacred as any in Egypt or Greece. May those who come after continue the work of remembering. May the connections that were severed be rejoined. May the wisdom that was fragmented be made whole. May we finally understand that human spiritual history is not a story of separate cultures stumbling independently towards truth, but of a unified tradition, ancient beyond measure, that planted the same seeds in different soils, and that the Celts preserved those seeds in the West as faithfully as the Egyptians did in the East, until such time as we would be ready to see the connection, and in seeing it, remember who we truly are and where we truly come from. Agree, and in that moment, I felt the stones themselves respond, felt the earth beneath vibrate with recognition, and I knew that the connection was not merely historical or theoretical, but alive, present, waiting for each person to discover it in their own time, in their own way, changing everything they thought they knew about history, about spirituality, about the profound wisdom that our ancestors possessed, and that we, their descendants, are only beginning to remember. And if you liked this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.